Hello. So in this video, I want to talk to you about ethics, and in what I'm going to talk about is primarily research ethics. So there's really, I would say, two schools of ethical thought. There's research ethics and professional ethics. Obviously, there's some overlap, but this is really about when you are studying and working with people, what are the ethics involved in that? So they're basically a way of distinguishing between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable behaviour. So it differs from your morals. So morals are your own kind of behaviours and opinions. Ethics is an acceptable behaviour that's defined by a group. And there are lots of ways that you can define that ethics. So if you take the Hippocratic Oath, for example, that whole medical community says that they'll do no harm. If you take a religious community, they'll say thou shalt not kill. And that is their ethical guidance. So within research institutions, within universities, there are, and also within like industrial bodies that study human behaviour and so on. So I'm thinking of user experience consultancies that would get participants. Human participants, they all have some kind of ethical mandate, some kind of ethical framework. In fact, there's a paper at the end which looks at how Microsoft created their most recent ethical framework, which is very interesting because it's based on research ethics. So what we're going to do is go through kind of why ethics came to be, some kind of examples of poor ethics that you should avoid, and then kind of more contemporary type ideas. Morals are personal to individual ethics or standards of behaviour expected of a group to which you belong. So we didn't used to have ethics, really. It was kind of in the 70s that ethics started becoming a thing that people should contend with, and a realisation that, okay, we have to protect the people that we're studying here. But there are two experiments that you may know of already. And these experiments were the basis of what is deemed to be acceptable behaviour towards other humans, or unacceptable in these cases, and were kind of widely publicised and triggers for calling for more ethical reform in research. So the Stanford prison experiment, this was early 1970s, 1971, and he was a psychologist, and what he wanted to do was test whether or not a person's circumstances and environment could influence their actions. So is mob mentality a thing? That sort of question. So they selected 12 students to be prison guards and 12 students to be prisoners. And they basically said, this is your role, and we want you to be guards and you to be prisoners. And they had to shut it down after 6 days. It was scheduled to go for 2 weeks. But the participants just behaved so poorly towards one another. They have physical damage, there was assaults, there was mental damage in terms of kind of mental torture being imposed. No one stood up. One person would take an action and you aligned yourself to be a guard or to side with your other prisoners. It became an us and them mentality very quickly. The people conducting the study didn't intervene in the beginning, and the situation got worse. And basically, there would have been irreparable damage done to the prisoners if it hadn't been stopped. And some of the people in that study reported PTSD symptoms afterwards, which is obviously extreme mental distress. So there's a video here on YouTube. I'm not going to watch it here because the videos are quite lengthy, but you can go back and have a look at the Stanford prison experiment and just get a sense of there's actual footage in this video, and you can see just what the prisoners endured and the behaviour that formed in both of those groups. It's valuable information, but the way it was achieved was obviously not ethical, and so there is a debate there about how much that should be allowed to contribute to science. The Milgram Experiment is the second one, and the Milgram Experiment is looking at how people react to authority figures and how authority figures demand obedience. And it kind of the study arose as a result of the things that came out of Nazi Germany, and people saying, well, I did it because I was told to. I committed these atrocities against other people because I was told to. So what they have is they have three individuals. They've got an experimenter, they've got a teacher who is the experimental subject or participant, and they've got a third person pretending to be a learner. So what they did was they showed you the learner being set up into a contraption which would administer electric shocks, and you were told that the rules of engagement for you, the participant, you will ask a question. If the learner gets it correct, you move on. If the learner doesn't, you administer a shock. And for every wrong question, you turn up the shock dial. And so they would have an experimenter kind of in a white coat, assuming the position of the authority in this case. And it was a disturbing thing. So the person that was pretending to be the learner, they would play recorded screams, anguish, anxiety, pain of being shocked. And every time the teacher said, I don't want to do this anymore, they would say, oh, the experiment must continue. Will you please continue with the experiment? And because the scientist in the white coat said so, 65% of people would have administered a lethal shock to that learner in that situation. So obviously a body of evidence there saying that actually, yes, this authority figure is a huge deal. But again, the person was misinformed about what the study was. They were told that it was a study about learning. They were not stopped when, in often cases, the teacher, the participant, displayed severe shock, symptoms of shock, anxiety. They were very distressed at the damage that they were inflicting to another human, and that was allowed to continue. So there are lots of reasons why it was an ethically dubious experiment. And again, there's a video on YouTube about the Milgram study that you can go and have a look, and you can see for yourself kind of what that study setup looked like. And there's been various versions since, and there was various kind of sub levels within it that was looking at kind of how the experimenter, how the authority figure behaved and so on, if you're interested. But certainly watch it to get a sense, if you haven't already, of just the severity of what would today be considered just highly unethical. So what have we learned from these studies and the sorts of studies that existed? So there was a report that came out in 1974, and this was prompted by the syphilis study. So the syphilis study, if you've not heard of it, was a study where the government arrived and told people of young black men within black communities that they were going to get free healthcare from the government if you would allow the government to record, your vital signs and record information about you in terms of your health. And what they were actually doing was they were tracking the natural progression of syphilis within a population, but they didn't treat the syphilis. So lots of young black men who had syphilis at the time weren't treated, and that led to things like, really bad complications, blindness, mental illness, death, and so on. And so when it came out that this is what had happened in the syphilis study, the BELMONT Report was commissioned. And the BELMONT Report is named after the place that it was written. So the whole report is there at that link that you can go and see. And again, there's a YouTube video with some more information, but it forms three parts. It's about a respect to the persons that are taking part in the study, the beneficence, so who's actually benefiting from the work that's being done, and elements of social justice, so is it fair, that sort of thing. So the first of those is respect for persons. So you've got to treat people as autonomous agents who can give informed consent. So they should be fully informed of what the costs are and what the benefits are of participation. And those benefits might be payments, they might be access to services, and then what are the costs? So you could be distressed. There is a risk of physical injury, etc. And the important part here is that individuals who have diminished autonomy, who are not able to give informed consent, are entitled to additional protection. So those protections are that someone else should assist them in making that decision, that they shouldn't be independently asked to make that decision. They might be given information in an alternative format, like an easy read version or something with symbols perhaps if they need it, or any other translation, and that you should take steps to make sure that that consent is informed. So rather than just saying, do you agree? Yes. You can say, do you agree? Yes. Okay, can you tell me in your own words what withdrawing from this experiment would mean? And to check that understanding. So that's about kind of having respect for a person who can make their own choices and make sure that people are fully informed of what they do. And the time when this happens is like particularly when people are vulnerable, and that is people with disabilities, people who are perhaps imprisoned, who have mental illness and don't fully understand, or who may sometimes understand and sometimes not. So that's all about making sure that someone doesn't take part as a result of their circumstance, as opposed to an approval that they want to take part in informed consent. The second is beneficence, so you should maximise benefits and minimise harm. And this is that when you analyse the benefits of the research, those risks should be applicable to both the individual and society. So in terms of risks that you have to patients, patients might have risk of eye strain or fatigue. It might be how you're going to use their data. Do they have confidentiality within that dissemination of the data? But you shouldn't do harm to people when it's not of value. So this is the argument around the Milgram study, is we did harm to participants, but if you look at that in the context of the world at that time, the atrocities that were being committed were now understood and could be prevented. And that's the argument for still making use of that data from the study. But in today's society, that risk would not be accepted. You know, that level of harm wouldn't be accepted. So weighing up that harm and risk is very important for the beneficence of the research. And then there's the justice. So who bears the burden of the research and who receives the benefit? So if you think of the syphilis study, the burden of that study was borne on poor black communities. So it was borne on people were basically distinguished in terms of their societal economic status and their race or ethnicity. And so ensuring that that burden is spread across society is important, because the entire society benefited from what could be seen as the persecution of that particular group of men. So each person needs an equal share, and according to need and effort, and according to societal contribution and the merit that that research will have. So you wouldn't put someone under undue distress for a small gain, but you may be able to argue that some distress with appropriate therapeutic response afterwards is useful to prevent an atrocity. So you always have to balance that, and there's no right and wrong answer. But the key thing here, I think, is ensuring that your participants are representative of society in some way. So if you have a study that you hope applies to all population in the world, then all population within the world needs to be represented in your participant group. You could not go to a prison and say, right, we can exert a lot of control over this situation because these people are imprisoned by society, and so we will do our study here when we can control a lot of the metrics around it. But the results will apply to all people. So that's obviously not a fair distribution of the justice and the burden. So some kind of current challenges that this has. So generally, when you're writing a framework for your ethics or making ethical decisions, that's what you should be thinking about, is those components of the Belmont report. And I mean, that was 1970s. It still equally applies today, although society does change. Those basic principles that underpin the Belmont report are still true, which kind of makes it all the more difficult when you get kind of these examples of things that actually are they breaking that convention? And typically this is through data and through our computational power that we can now exploit things much more easily. And because there is not a participant in front of you, it's harder for the person to understand the impact that that has on an individual, because what the person who's experimenting sees is data. They don't see people. And for me, that's the real kind of crux for a lot of these things. And when it becomes true, you know, if you think of like Cambridge Analytica, when that came out and the stories of the individuals involved were so powerful, that had those stories been known or interpreted at the beginning, would it still have happened? That human part is missing because it's just data, right? So one example I've got here is the experimental evidence of massive scale emotional contagion through social networks. So what happened here was people were exploiting data as it was presented to participants on Facebook. Now, those participants didn't know they were part of the study. Basically, anyone who had a Facebook ID could be part, and they took a sample of them. So it was almost 700,000 individuals were exposed. And what they wanted to see was, if everyone around you has an emotion, do you become that emotion? And so they wanted to see if you could experience that same emotion without being aware that this was why it had happened. So what they did was they took, I've got it here, they took two groups and they gave one group lots of positive posts. So those positive, they kind of, anything that their friends posted that was negative, they just hid so that you only saw positive things. And then the converse happened. They saw less. So one side they saw more positive, and on one side they saw more negative. And then, well, what happened? Well, when people saw more negative posts, they also posted more negative posts. They became more negative in comparison to their previous posts. And when people saw more positive things, they became more positive based on their previous posts, right? They were more positive than what they had posted the week, the month, the year before. And this is something that psychologists have kind of studied in person, that if everyone around you has a particular emotion, you're more likely to experience that emotion. But no one had really shown it in terms of, you know, this also happens online on social media where people are interacting as virtual entities. And what was most interesting, I guess, was that complete lack of emotion, so you don't see emotive posts, those people were less likely to express themselves at all. And the impact of that is huge. So people where, if you've got someone who's at risk of depression and suddenly you start only showing them negative posts, you can imagine what the consequences of that would be. Or someone who has paranoia or any other type of mental illness or impairment makes it very difficult to really reconcile why you would do that when you understand what the consequence for some individuals were. So does that study fit the requirements of that Belmont report? So is there respect for persons and informed consent? Does it benefit the entirety of society? And is there justice? Is there social justice in terms of the benefit and the burden? So while there was no informed consent, nobody knew they were even part of the study. And if you don't know they're part of the study, you've got no ability to withdraw, right? So if you are experiencing negative effects, you will not know that that is a result of a study that someone else has socially engineered your emotion, which has triggered whatever for you. And there's no awareness of the burden that individual participants take. So yeah, sorry, I've misspelled depression there, but if you have an existing depression and then, you're suddenly faced with all of these negative things, the burden that you as an individual bear within that study is much greater than someone who doesn't have existing depression. And so there was really no kind of reconciliation of that information at all. So one of the big ethical questions is, well, do you still use this data? Right? There's a lot of data in there about how you can manipulate that environment. And that information feeds into persuasive systems. Medical persuasive systems, I don't really want to exercise because I can't be bothered. And can you use that to encourage someone who's in a depressive state to become more positive? But should you, given the consequence that it had on individuals? So that's really the kind of ethical dilemma involved. Again, same with Milgram, same with Stanford. Can you use that data that has been gathered in a dubious manner for good? Should you use it at all? And the other example I have is that kind of the map of the internet. So in 2013, someone hacked into 500,000 computers. And what they did was they looked at how that computer connected to the internet, how it connected to other computers via uTorrent torrent sites and things like this. So now we know how computers talk to each other, which groups of clusters talk to one another. And is it ethical to use that data? There are privacy concerns. There are data concerns in terms of no one allowed you to make that detail public. It was an illegal hack. But can we use that data to show how viruses can be? So if I have a virus and I'm in a torrent group, that virus is going to be propagated, and can we use it to do good things in terms of security and privacy, even though it was illegally gathered? So lots of questions rather than answers, I think, around ethics. But yeah, I've got a few basic rules to live by just for ethical user involvement. Be sensible, be safe, and be sure. Always do your informed consent, check again. Every time a participant interacts with you, you need some kind of assent that yes, this is okay. Don't do any harm to people, and just treat others like you would like to be treated. How would you feel if you were the person in the Facebook study? Probably not very good. So try and avoid that when you interact with other people. So be sensible, be safe, and be sure. And if anyone's kind of looking for some more that you might be interested in reading, I've got 2 papers here just for further interest. The first one is about situational ethics, and that is about if I'm doing a study within a context. So let's say in this case looking at a mobile phone application within a particular environment, a school, a community centre, whatever, and the person who has that device says yes, they want to be part of it, and some people say no. But if the people who say no are then borrowing someone else's device, does that constitute a consent? Because they know what that device is being used for. So that's quite interesting about we have all these formal approaches, but actually how do these fit within some real life context that people are using them? And the second one of them is something I've already mentioned before, and this is about reviewing all of the ethics within some of the biggest conferences that we have in HCI, and then using that to create a framework for conducting ethical research on the web. So both of them, interesting papers. You can download them just by clicking the link. They're free for a few months from now, but you can access them using the VPN, and you'll get access to them, download the PDF and have a read. Okay, so that is ethics, and hopefully just some kind of general food for thought in terms of how you interact with others if you're doing any kind of participant studies.